Welcome everyone in Anteater Land. It's great to have you join our 22nd installment of the Lunch with Eaters virtual program series. We've been doing these programs about every other month. It's a virtual lunch and learn program built specifically for the UCI alumni and friends community. I'm Jeff Minhas. I'm your host today. I'm Executive Director at the Alumni Association. Now, let's introduce our featured speaker for today, Tracy Lee. Tracy graduated from UCI in 2011 and earned a BA in Literary Journalism, Global Cultures. She is an award-winning producer with experience in digital media, journalism, and audio-video production. She is currently the Director of Strategy, Growth, and Insights at Sony Pictures Creative Center, working on digital strategy for Jeopardy and Wheel of Fortune. Prior to Sony, she was a digital editorial manager at NBC News, overseeing the network's coverage of Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. Now, everyone, join me in giving Tracy a great big virtual Anteater welcome to the virtual stage. Hi, Tracy. Welcome.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me. I've got my UCI pride here, wearing it today.
Well, always wearing your UCI pride in one way or another, but yeah, it's great to see you. Thanks for joining us today, Tracy.
Yeah, of course. It was such an honor to be asked.
Yeah, so as you know, this program is to learn about interesting alumni doing interesting things in the world, and I think everyone's going to agree in short order that you certainly are in that category. We all share the common bond of being anteaters, having studied at UCI. Perhaps we can start on some common ground. Tracy, what are some of your favorite memories from your time at UCI?
I think, so many of my memories are kind of wrapped up in just campus life. I worked at the School of the Arts at UCI for about 3.5 years. So almost, it feels like my entire time there. Got to see a lot of really amazing productions put on by the School of the Arts that I kind of feel like sometimes when you get to a place that is so big, and for me, UCI was such a step away from, the types of environments I was used to and the types of schools that I've gone to. There was so much to experience. It was really overwhelming. So getting very involved in campus life helped me become more involved with the activities on campus. And then I also worked for the new university, the campus newspaper, for 3 years. And that also was a really great way to kind of figure out what events were happening on campus, go to games more, things that maybe I wouldn't have thought of doing because I didn't know a lot of people who would have gone to those things with me. So it helped me kind of step out of my comfort zone. And I met not only like some of my closest friends at the new university, but people who I ended up collaborating with in the future, whether it was in journalism or in my current role here at Sony, just like people I've reached out to either connections wise because they're working in an industry that's connected to mine, or just that I've worked with as reporters and producers and editors. So really these connections, I mean, it's been 10 years since I graduated, but it feels like everything that I've done at UCI was just like building up this wonderful kind of career path I've been on.
Yeah, that's something I think many can identify with in the audience. The New U, for example, has been around for almost the history of the university. Actually, funny thing, at the Newkirk Alumni Center, which is our home on campus, we have actual printouts, original prints of the first student newspaper. It used to be called Spectrum, I think. Mm-hmm. And it evolved into the New U, which many other alumni have been a part of, like you. And then there are more than 600 clubs and organizations on campus that have common bonds as well. So tapping into those experiences, that's great advice too. Okay, so what started your journey into the world of storytelling?
I think when, it's interesting because when I chose literary journalism as a major, I didn't really know what it was because it's not something that, journalism, English, comparative literature, but literary journalism was something that I never heard of before. And my parents are immigrants. We didn't really grow up with a lot of knowledge or connections into different types of industries like that. Journalism especially was like far away from anything that I even thought about doing. But I've always loved writing and reading. And I think my love of storytelling comes from just this like oral tradition that my family had of just like telling stories, because that's how we would communicate. And when you grow up, I think being a translator for your parents or your family anyways, you kind of just become this natural storyteller, right? You want to help other people communicate. And so that almost felt like a very natural flow and fit into what I decided to do pursuing journalism. And I think one of the most wonderful things about literary journalism is this emphasis on storytelling, and that could be anything, right? It could be highlighting voices that typically don't have the opportunity to be highlighted. It could be looking into subcultures or genres or communities that perhaps have never had a voice in quote unquote the mainstream. And so that really kind of built my love of storytelling even more as I kind of realized I could do it as a profession, and kind of seeing what other opportunities there were that weren't just a traditional path of journalism. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I didn't have to graduate and think, oh, I could only write for a newspaper, or I could only write for magazines or something like that. There's such a world, a very rich world of storytelling that comes out of especially digital media these days. And so that's kind of the foundation for it. And then because I was graduating at a time when social media was really starting to explode in a different kind of a way, where brands and news organizations were starting to use social media, I kind of built a little niche in that area. And so my first internships and then my first jobs were really about telling brands and news organizations how to use the internet to tell stories and how to do it in an engaging way. Because NPR, for instance, they made fantastic radio, but in 2011, the website and blogging and stuff was still something new they were trying out, social media. Same with at MSNBC, later at NBC News. So getting to find those different areas where you're kind of challenging yourself. It's like a puzzle, right? How do you use this platform to tell a engaging and compelling story that's true to somebody's voice, but still continue to grow a new audience? And so like, those are all the things that kind of have led me to where I am right now at Sony.
That is, you're clearly a phenomenal communicator, because I got so much out of that. I'm sure the audience did as well. Loved one of your earlier points, how storytelling came naturally to you as with your parents as immigrants. Many of us at UCI have similar pathways. Either, first generation is more than half the student body. My dad's an immigrant, same kind of thing, but I never thought of it the way you did, how you are naturally a storyteller, and you're translating the way your family communicates, and then carrying those skills forward into different media or different mediums, communication channels. Fascinating. So the next step from there, as you started your career, you've had multiple experiences, but then where you are now, Sony Pictures, and you have big, very important, significant jobs. How did you get to Sony Pictures on this path?
It's interesting too there. I mean, everything is interesting to me. I think that's why I'm a storyteller. A lot of people have asked me, why did you leave journalism? I don't necessarily look at it as having left journalism, as more so just expanding that storytelling, right? When I chose to leave NBC, it was because I was offered a fellowship at USC, and it was an opportunity to further expand my skills. And I think what USC offered me at that moment was I would get to teach and work with students who were kind of like the next leaders in newsrooms, the next leaders in the media. And they're obviously, that generation is consuming media and creating media in a very different way than I was creating and consuming media when I was in college. And so I think that the best way to create content and really continue to grow is to talk directly to the people who are creating the next wave, right? The next chapters. And so I really wanted that opportunity, and I wanted to, like I said, expand my own skill set. So I left for a year to teach at USC, and it was only supposed to be a year, and then I was going to jump back into journalism, but then the pandemic happened. So the second half of my time at USC was all virtual learning and trying to figure out what the world was going to look like when it comes to journalism as well. So in that time, after I finished my fellowship at USC, I you know, a lot of newsrooms were cutting jobs. I think everyone was kind of at a hiring freeze. I chose to freelance, which is something I've done in the past. So I would freelance as a writer. I freelanced as a media consultant. I worked with some agencies and media companies, kind of consulting on things like podcasting or social media, even with some places that were doing like entry-level kind of journalism workshops. I was freelancing into that area. And then I saw this opportunity pop up, like a job listing on LinkedIn at Sony Pictures, and it was to build these teams that would be handling the digital footprint of Jeopardy and Wheel of Fortune. These are two shows that have been on TV for decades. Wheel of Fortune is going into its 40th season next season. They're in the cultural zeitgeist. Everyone, whether you watch it or not, you are familiar with these two shows. And at the same time, they've never really had ownership of their digital channels. You know, a lot of brands will treat social media as like a marketing opportunity, sure, but there is a real storytelling component that goes there. And these shows wanted to really build on that and find ways to tell their own stories. And, you know, there's such a rich history with both of these shows. And so they were trying to build this team. And on the job description, it said they were looking for people who have newsroom experience, which I was like, I have newsroom experience. And I love these shows. These are shows that I grew up watching. And so I applied, and the amazing person who was building this team herself used to be a journalist and kind of had that same approach to storytelling and wanting to help these two brands really take an editorial approach to their marketing. And so I decided to, you know, a lot of people say, oh, you switched over to the dark side because you left journalism, but I don't see it that way. To me, it's a storytelling opportunity that exists at a place like Sony the same way it did at NBC News or any other news organization that I've worked for. So that's kind of my path toward there. And every day is a challenge of trying to figure out what the audience is responding to, trying to create content that the audience will enjoy. And, you know, that's really kind of what I do on a daily basis now.
Well, that is very intriguing, especially considering the content you're working on. As you said, in the cultural zeitgeist. I mean, you're right. Every single person knows about those, and you have the reins to manage the digital engagement. So, you know, along those lines, what are some of the things you've learned in your current role as director of strategy, growth, and insights?
Yeah, I've learned that people say you can't predict what is going to grow an audience online because something can trend and you won't expect it to, right? But what we can see are opportunities to continue to grow and own our brand's narrative without letting the news cycle control it. And I say that as sort of a direct kind of a reference to everything that Jeopardy went through last year. Now, obviously, there was a lot of chaos. Jeopardy was in the news a lot. And that was something where, you know, we can't predict it, right? You know, a lot of us who worked on the show had no idea that something would happen the next day that would affect kind of what everyone was talking about. And so it was a confusing period, but one thing we can control is that the show is continuing. We have new shows, we have amazing contestants. And Alex Trebek used to always say that the shows, you know, Jeopardy is not about the host. It's not about all of that. It's about the contestants and it's about the game. And that the contestants in the game are things that have been like mainstays of Jeopardy for decades. And so really kind of highlighting that, focusing on the reasons people love Jeopardy, lets us control our own story and lets us at least not kind of fall victim to a news cycle that might tank our engagement or destroy an audience, the audience's faith in us. You know, we continued on in sort of a very steady fashion. And I think that kind of provided some stability to people online who are very engaged with the show and who care a lot about the show as well. So I've definitely learned that flexibility is great, but also making sure that you are confident in your own storytelling has really proven to help grow both of these shows on an enormous level. And I've also learned that there is an opportunity to do this kind of storytelling in, you know, the world of marketing and brand management. You know, people say when you approach storytelling on this level, you should think like a fan, but you know, you're acting like a marketer, but think like a fan, think like a storyteller, think like a journalist. That keeps you one step ahead of anything that might kind of deter the storytelling you're trying to do.
Yeah. And it's interesting to note you've been through some serious challenges. It's not just taking a show that's existed for 40 years and taking its digital presence to the next level, but maybe later in this program we'll hear more about the trials and the issues that Jeopardy went through. And I'll use this as an opportunity to remind the audience to submit Q&A questions along the way, and then Tracy will be able to answer them later in the hour. I have one more question for you before we just shift a little bit. What advice do you have for someone trying to follow in a similar career path?
I think my strongest advice, whether you want to be a writer, whether you want to be a producer, a podcaster, in whatever medium you want to create content in, also be a consumer, be an avid consumer. I'll sometimes talk to students about this in the past, or I'll talk to peers or colleagues and they'll say, I want to start a podcast, or I want to make a YouTube channel. And I'll ask, what podcasts do you listen to? What YouTube channels do you follow? And they don't really have an answer to that. Or they might say like kind of the big names, right? The big channels or the big shows out there, but you should really kind of dive into that niche, dive into that medium, dive into that platform, and know what it's like to experience it from a consumer side as well, right? Because if you're more aware of how someone's going to receive something, the user experience, for instance, on YouTube, if you know that you as a consumer look for an end screen because you want to keep watching more videos, because you want to stay on the YouTube channel you're on. Well, when you create your content and create an engaging end screen, like those types of more mechanical, I guess, conversations, but you should be familiar with the space you're trying to create in and be a fan of the space as well.
Awesome. Well, thanks for sharing that. I'm sure we may get some questions about your career trajectory as well. A lot of alumni, especially students and young alumni, like to learn how you got to successful levels in your career. So real quick, we're going to pause. Everyone in the audience, I want you to engage. We have a poll that should be popping up on your screen right now, so we can learn a little bit more about you and your interests. What drew you to this webinar topic? Of course, assuming if you didn't already know Tracy, you want to get in the field of entertainment, generally interested in this topic, or you're in a similar position or other. Leave that up there for a few more seconds. Awesome. Okay, so it's spread out pretty evenly. A lot of general interest in this topic. 3 are in similar positions in the industry, and another 3 want to get into the field. So good to know. Good to know. Thanks everyone for sharing that. We'll have another poll at the end of the event as well. Okay, Tracy. So I have some more questions for you, and the first one is back to referencing something that was in your bio. The importance of representation for Asian American Pacific Islander representation, which is something you've actually worked on professionally. Can you speak to the importance of AAPI representation to you?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I am Asian American, so that's like step one of why it's important to me. To call back to what you said about my bio, I was the digital editorial manager at NBC News, covering Asian American Pacific Islander communities. This was a vertical or a section of NBCnews.com that was started around 2014. And then in 2015, I sort of took over as the editor of it and kind of grew the team from there. So when it started, there was not a lot of opportunities for Asian American and Pacific Islander communities and voices to have their stories heard or their communities highlighted in a way that didn't treat them like victims. And this is to say, oftentimes you will see marginalized voices or communities highlighted when something bad happens to them, right? And not that those things shouldn't be reported on and shouldn't be highlighted, but this is something my colleague who oversaw NBC Latino used to say: we want our communities to feel like the subject of a story and not the object of a story. We want to control the opportunity to tell our own stories, to highlight our achievements, to highlight the issues that might plague us, right? So that when you see Latino communities highlighted in the news, you're not only seeing it in context of immigration struggles, which are a big component to the conversation happening, but at the same time, that's not all that community is. the Asian American and Pacific Islander community is very diverse. Obviously, no community of color is monolithic, but Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders often haven't had the representation on a mainstream, quote unquote, mainstream news level in the past. And when they have, it was always in the context of like a terrible thing happened to them. So what would it look like for storytelling to come straight from our communities? And so what I did and what I tried to focus on was ensuring that our freelancers who we worked with, because we had a very small budget, whether they were writers, reporters, freelance or editors, social media folks, documentary producers, we kind of veered into documentary territory, were all people of color who could say, you know, these are the stories that are affecting my community. These are the voices that are important to telling this type of story, which was something very different that you weren't seeing places like NBC News or CNN or elsewhere really doing. They would have their two experts on a single topic, and they would, you know, have them talk about everything related to their communities. But we were building a roster of experts that, you know, could be used across the network. And so for me, it all kind of goes back to what I talked about in wanting to make sure that growing up, I was translating for my parents, you know, wanting them to feel represented, because part of me always used to think when they came here in the 60s, what would it have looked like if they actually saw themselves represented in more places, rather than coming here and feeling like they didn't belong, like they were constantly having to play catch up, like they didn't understand what people were talking about or why they were being treated a certain way. Was there an opportunity for us on this level on digital and expanding into other social channels? Was there an opportunity to kind of change how we tell the story? And so that to me was really important, not only to do that for my family, but to do it for other people who might be in similar positions. And so I really kind of prioritized not only putting Asian American and Pacific Islander faces in front of a camera, but putting them behind the scenes as well to be in charge of what that storytelling looks like.
Wow. Well, that's very powerful, and incredible that you found a way to affect that in your career and bring that to the mainstream via NBC News. And you're right, the differentiation can be stark with what we see in the media and the way other platforms handle or don't handle or ignore or mishandle. So incredible accomplishments to you, and kudos. Of course, this topic, representation, diversity, equity, and inclusion, huge priorities at UCI. Another one of our common bonds. We are an Asian American, Pacific Islander, Native American serving institution. That's a distinction we have because of the resources we provide and our demographics. So, so glad to see that you've carried that forward and contributed. So let's go back to your shows a little bit. How do you tackle the creative strategy for the shows that you work on?
It's interesting there as well. I feel like I've said that a lot. Like I said, these shows, we film a lot, right? And we film in advance. We'll film months in advance sometimes. And so we know the content that's going to be occurring. Now, we can't account for the conversation happening in the moment when those shows air, but we know when something big is going to happen. So I'm going to reference, for instance, on Jeopardy, just last week, we had an amazing champion wrap up her run. She went on a 40-game streak, which is incredible. That's second to Ken Jennings, right? It's a big deal, and that's something that's very hard to do. And you know, when it comes to determining how we create that content online, what I'm doing and what I've been introducing to these teams is, like I said, a newsroom approach, an editorial approach. So it's utilizing search and social listening tools primarily to understand the trends of what people search for around these two shows. So every morning I'm looking at the night before, what have people been Googling related to Jeopardy or Wheel of Fortune? I'm looking at what people are talking about on social media, and that is everything from Facebook to TikTok to YouTube to Reddit, kind of bouncing around and looking at that. We have programs set up to kind of pull in a lot of that information, because our digital audience, or the people online who are the most engaged with our content, might not be the same as the people who are watching every single night. I know these shows get millions of viewers every single night, but they're not all online. So the audience online might care about something different than a viewer at home cares about. So right now it's trying to balance what can be true to the brand's voice, the show's voice, what can be true to those viewers that we know are watching based on Nielsen ratings. And then online, we have very specific data. We can see the person who is tweeting at us, what other accounts do they follow? What kind of account might they be interested in? So it's kind of trying to take in all that information. So every morning I kind of just like inhale it like a computer and then analyze it from there. Looking at on Instagram, is it photos or videos that do the best? On YouTube, what's the length of videos that people are going to sit through? Taking all of that information into account and then pairing it with the amazing content that the shows are creating and providing and finding a balance. So my job is really just kind of to sit in between the creative side and our social content side and the show as well, and tell them what I think they should do. Do they always take my advice? No, but at least I can, build it all based off of data. So that's kind of how a creative decision might be made. So for instance, on Jeopardy, we see a lot of people talking about Jeopardy as a sport. And so a couple of weeks ago, we started releasing daily box scores, very similar to if you're watching a basketball game and you're looking at your ESPN app, you're going to follow along with the stats there. So we started doing the same for Jeopardy as well. And that's gotten a wonderful response from people who have been talking about stats for decades on Jeopardy. And now we're kind of releasing stats that people might not have seen before, or they don't have access to because they're, behind the scenes information. For Wheel of Fortune, we see a lot of people really engaging with our games on the website, but maybe the user experience wasn't the best before. They were coming to games and then leaving the site. Well, we want to keep them on the site. So what kind of content do we create to put on the site that will lead them to another page, whether it is to watch videos or to play more games or sign up for our newsletter? So it's using all of that information, understanding our audience behavior, and then building creative strategy around that.
That's a lot, but extremely.
It is, it is a lot. And these are shows, like I said, we have new shows every single night, 5 days a week. And so it's a lot of content, yeah.
Millions of viewers every night.
Yeah, like on 9 or 10 million viewers, I think, for Jeopardy each night was the last number I saw.
So the data you inhale every morning, that I wonder if you've created your own process, thinking about like, what does it look like behind the scenes? Do you have social intelligence tools, your own kind of data analytics platform, or anything you've developed to make it consumable for you? Because that's 10 million viewers, new data every day. How can you possibly process that and create your own learnings?
Yeah, I set up filters and alerts for things like on Google News, right? And the shows have PR teams and communications teams that are also looking at that because they're more familiar with maybe journalists who might be writing about it or things like that. I'm mainly looking at our social platforms. So every single day we're tracking if our followers are going up or if they're going down. If they're going down, we have to look at, is there a specific reason why? Maybe it's a platform issue. I constantly am talking with the platform. So we have representatives across every social media platform, talking to them about new developments or questions or issues we have to figure out kind of how we can best leverage new tools that they might be releasing. And it is also looking at, our social media. We have to read the comments. So if anyone ever wonders who's reading the comments, it is me and my team. Sometimes it's not always great. We are reading it both in real time as the show airs and then the next morning, because conversations do continue throughout the night. And these two shows are unique in that, they're syndicated. So they air at all different times across the country. It's not like we're a primetime show and we can know these are the hours when people are going to be talking about the show. The show airs as early as noon in some markets, and then as late as, of course, 8 p.m. Or 7:30 here on the West Coast. So the conversation happens all day about these shows.
And you're pulling
which is good and bad. Yeah, it's a lot, but I have a system of places that I look at. We do have tools that we use. I kind of built an infrastructure to, I don't say force is the right word, but convince these shows that they should look at their data on a weekly and monthly basis, because what they were doing before was looking at it on a quarterly basis, which is typically how, when you're advertising or selling ads or whatnot, more on the television side, you do things on a quarterly basis. But digital, you cannot wait 3 months to figure out what your data is telling you. So not only do I look at it daily, but I've put starting last year, I started to put together these monthly reports where we would basically break down every single post we post on every single platform, look at the engagement rate, look at why something did well and something didn't, and using that information to inform how we create the content moving forward. So luckily, I don't have to sit there and create the content. I have an amazing team of people, colleagues, people who have been very creative and have a lot of great ideas as well. The thing that I'm doing, and sometimes I have to be like the fun police, being like, that sounds fun, but it's not going to do well on the platform. But if that's the case, we have to try to figure out how do we make it work for the platform it is. It is every single platform, things do well that are different. So long video might perform well on YouTube, but not on Instagram. So how do we amend the content, and how do we drive traffic to a platform where it is going to do well? So yeah, it's a lot of sitting at the computer and reading the internet. So sometimes when people ask what I do, I say I read the internet for a living.
Well, there's a lot that goes into that as we're learning. So you started to touch on this, but how has social media and its trends affected? Obviously, it's affected what you do every day, but how has it affected storytelling?
Yeah, I mean, you can't control what people are going to say, right? I think in the past, if you were to look at a more traditional take on something like creating a commercial or creating an ad or a billboard, you're creating the content and putting it out there. And newspapers were like this in a sense too, right? You put the information out there and you're not necessarily getting real-time feedback, right? You might hear about it in a letter to the editor later, or you might hear about it the next day if someone were to come up and talk to you about it. But now you can say something on the news and 2 seconds later, someone will tweet about it, or someone will tell you you're wrong on a social platform, right? It's the same with Jeopardy and Wheel. We're not waiting to get this data at a later time. We can see the conversation happening in real time on a place like Reddit, on Twitter, on TikTok. We're seeing people share exactly how they feel, and it's not always going to be what we were hoping they would get out of it. And so if that's the case, we have to be responsive and flexible to that. Okay, people really hate this type of content. What do we do about it? Now, that's something that we are confident about and is true to our brand. We're not going to not continue to post it, but maybe there's something people are not responding to. It's almost like a real-time focus group, and you can get that information immediately, which is great, but it's also terrifying and can be overwhelming. So I can understand why some people might not want to do it that way, because it does mess with your brain a little bit sometimes, because it can stop you from wanting to create something. And so really my role is to kind of be a filter, right? To tell you if that person complaining on Twitter has a valid complaint or not as well.
Okay, thanks for sharing that. Now, so back to, where you are at Sony Pictures and the Creative Center, what do you enjoy most about your role there? And what are you hopeful for in the future? I
think that the thing I enjoy the most is also the thing that gives me the biggest headache, which is reading the internet, right? I am a big fan of people who love things. Like, I think that fandoms are super interesting. I think people who are super fans of something are like so interesting and so creative. And these shows come with massive fans and sort of a built-in fandom, people who created their own content for decades and stuff like that because they loved it so much. And I think that that's really cool. That's something that I identify with as someone who kind of grew up in the age of the internet, I guess. You look for these communities where you can share this common interest, and these shows definitely have that. And so I do love reading. It can be a lot when we have to read some of the more negative comments and feedback, but it's not like we're censoring them. We let them call our show boring or whatever it is that they say about it. But I also really love hearing the stories from people who have a connection with the show. We'll see a lot of people on Instagram or TikTok, especially on the Wheel of Fortune side, they'll share their family dinners in front of the TV watching Wheel of Fortune, or they'll share their pets watching the show. And I think that's so fun. And it's an exciting world to kind of be a part of, because these people have welcomed the shows into their homes for years, for some people decades. So now we get to actually really feel like we're a part of it and give them more access to these shows that they love. And so that's something that I really love about the job. And as overwhelming as social media can be, because it feels like every day there's a new platform or a new format, and there's so much content and noise out there. I think it's really just kind of opened the door for people to do more of this type of storytelling, whether it's about our two shows that we love, but it could be about anything. It could be other studios that are doing it for their shows. It could be people who are doing it for their small businesses. Like, I think that there's just so much opportunity because of the internet when it comes to storytelling, that the positives really do outweigh the negatives.
Yeah, well, there's been several big things, especially with Jeopardy. Obviously, a lot of the stuff that was in the news, when you're making front page news on, the big news outlets with Jeopardy and the hosts and everything, and tragedy. But then also, I remember I think it was the Tournament of Champions, which I got like super interested in. I don't know if you were already there for that, but there was so much going back and forth with Ken and the other contestants and the strategies they had. So when you're like really not just in the zeitgeist, but in the front page news, how do you adapt in your role, and how does that affect how you approach what you're doing every day?
Yeah, I mean, like I said before, we can't always predict how people are going to respond to something or what might be happening at the time, but we know our content and we know our shows. So for instance, I talked a little bit about Jeopardy Stats Project. This was something we've been wanting to do for a while. We knew people were talking about, and then suddenly during a taping a couple months ago, Ken Jennings is at the top and he talks about how like, we're going to start releasing these stats, and all of us were like, wait, there's a date for it now. And so it kind of like puts us in a quicker motion of like, okay, now we have this date, this episode's going to air on this date. So we have to make sure that we're creating the content by this date. But it was something we'd all been talking about and working on already. So that's like a very small example. In terms of something like the hosts and all of that stuff, again, we can't really control how people are going to respond to something. We can only take in the information. But the studio and the show and the producers who have worked on the show for a very long time, they are experts in it. They've done it forever. They know the show back in front. Those decisions, which are being made way above my pay grade anyways, I don't think that a couple of people online who complain about the show every single night, which we do have those people, are necessarily going to be the reason why we completely shift focus. But again, it's my job to sort of take in some of these complaints and figure out if it's something that will affect kind of how we move forward. I don't know if that's the best answer that I can give without revealing all the secrets, if you will. But I think in any sort of brand, any sort of company, when they listen to the consumers, it's taking in what everyone is saying and trying to filter for the best result possible. And something like how everyone feels about the hosting situation, that is almost like a fire hose you can't really control, because everyone has a very strong opinion. Everyone has such a passion for this show, but I think that's what makes it so great. The conversations, I think that's what made everything feel so robust, and people really cared about it because they really care about the show. And at the end of the day, you have a very engaged fan base who love and care about the show and the future of the show. That to us sends a very strong message that people just want to have a say and they just want to be heard.
Absolutely. I guess that's kind of what it comes down to, and how you manage that and engage individuals that way. So now it's time to pivot against. We have a lot of really good questions already from the audience, so I want to try to get through as many of them as we can. Feel free to continue to put questions in there, folks. We'll try to circle back after the event if we run out of time. But questions from the audience now, Tracy. First one I want to bring up, on back to the content. Almina Karakawala. Hi, Almina. We're classmates. Thank you for joining us. She has a great question for you, Tracy. With the volume of digital content that exists, what tactics do you use to make your content stand out from the field?
I do think it's a little unfair for me to say like, oh, just create the good content, right? Because I work for two brands that are very recognizable. So, we created and we know a fan base is going to come. I think when it comes to creating something that might be new, right? Like this is maybe not the most highbrow example, but a couple years ago, I was really interested in podcasting. And I was like, oh, I want to start learning how to create a podcast. Well, for me, the best way to learn how to do something is just to do it. So a friend of mine who actually went to UCI as well, and we worked together, we started a podcast about, we picked a format that was very easy. So we did a TV show rewatch podcast on Dawson's Creek, which, by the way, was not streaming anywhere at the time when we started doing it. So we did it mainly because we figured no one would be looking for it. And so we could make all the mistakes we wanted to. We were not trying to market it. And then suddenly it just like picked up on its own, really. We just created this very niche thing that a niche community of people online were looking for. And we didn't really realize that they were looking for it. And then it kind of blew up from there. We did the podcast for 3 years and we ended it in 2020. And it still has like 8,000 listeners per month, even after ending it 2 years later. And like, nice. We get emails from around the world about it. So really it's just, when you approach your kind of content in a very crowded space, be very confident about your, I don't want to say your brand, but your voice and the direction you're trying to go and like the message you're trying to send. Be very confident about what it is you're trying to say. Because I'll see a lot of times people will start newsletters or that'll start TikTok accounts that are aimed towards something, but then they get caught up in the trends, trying to like do the things on the platform they think are going to rise above. But I think if you continue to create the content that you feel confident in with the message that you're trying to send, it's one of those like build it and they will come kind of things. If there's no place at the table for it, make your own table and people who are looking for it will find you.
Yeah, well, here's another great question. This is from Ravi Valetti. Hey, Ravi, nice to see you. Thanks for joining us. How do you cope, Tracy? Any self-care tips? It takes a lot of courage to navigate what can be the toxic media societal landscape of the US these days. And thank you for your leadership, Ravi adds. But how do you cope and manage in your career and life?
It is a lot. And sometimes I will spend, a couple hours reading our comments and being like, wow, people are mean. I have learned, especially working from home, because I think this is the most challenging part, right? Because now your work is literally in your home. And so it is hard to separate it. I do kind of block off time for myself where I am not looking at my phone or my computer or watching these shows on TV, where whether it is, going for a walk or talking to people who are not at all in my industry or asking about the shows. Because sometimes I'll talk to people who will be like, oh, tell me everything about these shows that you work on. And I'm like, I just don't want to talk about work. I try to block out that time. So I'm very much into like calendar blocking. So it is setting off, 2 or 3 hours where I literally am not, I put my stuff in another room or I put it in a closet and I can't look at it. I really had to force myself to do that because it is too easy to continue to scroll on my phone. Even in my personal Twitter account, I'll still see stuff about these shows pop up and then have to be like, okay, I need to separate it more. So just drawing very clear lines between when I'm working and when I'm not working, even though I am kind of always connected in some way, being very intentional about not responding to an email. This is not life or death, kind of categorizing it under that, and then feeling more comfortable with drawing those kind of boundaries.
Well, that being said, I apologize for making you talk about your work during the lunch hour.
Oh, that's okay.
I don't know if you pre-booked this, but man, that's great to know, though. It's very important, obviously, to manage your life, have a sustainable approach to it. Now we have 2 questions, one from Sharon Jawar and Jackie Wu, who want to know more about how to use Storytell well. So Sharon asks, what are your top 5 tips to storytell well in a business setting? And Jackie asks, for folks who want to become a better storyteller, what do you recommend?
Having conversations is always kind of like the foundation of it, right? Sometimes when it comes to storytelling approach, right? And I see this a lot with people who might be more of like the broadcast journalism side, where they're used to, okay, I need to produce a segment for TV that is 2 minutes. And so the questions, they come up with questions, and then those are the only questions they feel like they can ask, right? Because they need to get to the point of something. And for me, I think this is where literary journalism came in handy, right? Because they always focused on how an interview is just a conversation. A story is just about a feeling, right? It's about the emotion you connect with it and finding common threads between the story you're trying to tell and maybe your own personal experiences or the experiences of people around you. And I think that's where conversations come from. So anytime I have to write a story or we're producing a video or something, I'm thinking about that. What's the emotion you want to convey? What is the one thing, like the elevator pitch of it? What's the one sentence that you want to tell someone about this story that they should know? If you only had, when I reference elevator pitch, it's like an elevator ride, right? If you only had 10 seconds to tell someone what it is you're trying to get across with your video, your article, whatever you're making, what is it you want to say? And so kind of knowing that, boiling it down to this is the one thing that is the most important to me, then you can build from there. Because sometimes with a story, it's like there's so many moving parts, there's so many voices, so many pieces you want to highlight. Start gathering all of that, but then narrow down and figure out what is the one focus that you want to like really touch on or that you really want to highlight, and then grow it from there. And then you start to pull in the other pieces that kind of fit with that. Not everything is going to make it, unfortunately. And you have to, it's another part of storytelling. You have to be okay with kind of killing those anecdotes or voices that you might really love, but finding maybe another home for them is also a good opportunity. But that's kind of like my major tip. Have more conversations. I used to talk to people, over dinner or whatever, and sometimes they would be like, "This feels like an interview, like, like you're asking so many questions," and it's just a natural curiosity with like the world and how people's minds work. I think is really the foundation to all storytelling.
Okay. So folks in the audience are going to get to learn from this. There's one comment I want to draw your attention to, and actually a question from Joanna Tavares Rager. So Joanna is actually exploring the possibility of creating a new field, developing something new and transformative that is not necessarily entertainment, but builds on the storytelling knowledge that people like you, Tracy, have accumulated in order to support and promote social and environmental causes. So she says she knows some people are working on that, but her impression is that the storytelling focus is still very timid, particularly on climate action. Do you have any advice for Joanna or any comments on her idea that she's trying to create this new and transformative medium?
Yeah, I mean, I like the part where you said, or she noted about how the storytelling still feels a little bit new to that field, right? Anytime I'm trying to create something, and I do this right now with Jeopardy and Wheel, I'll talk to somebody who is not so much not familiar with the shows, but like doesn't really know as much as maybe the folks I talk to who work every day know about like the ins and outs of it, right? Because you've got your core fans, your core engagers, and then you have maybe people who just are not very connected with the product or the topic. Talk to those people. I don't like using the phrase like dumb down, because I think that's sometimes what people will use. Like, if I were to dumb down this initiative or this cause or whatever, how would I do it for somebody? I try to think of it as like reapproaching how you have the conversation. I often will kind of approach my parents with it because they are fans of the shows I work on and they care about some of the issues that I care about, but they're not like as into the language or the terminology or things like that. And really, at the end of the day, the stories you try to tell should just feel like you're having a conversation with somebody over coffee. So let's go back to the example of Asian American Pacific Islander representation. One of the documentaries I produced was about the deportation of Cambodian refugees from the US. And when we were putting it together, a lot of complex political topics, a lot of history, a lot of things that require a lot of knowledge about certain things that perhaps are not taught in schools. So all of those kinds of things, which make for a very complicated subject for a documentary that is 1.5 to 2 hours long. So really, it is just figuring out the best way to sit down over coffee with someone and say, let me tell you what's happening, and have it feel like your oral storytelling, like it is a conversation. Have it feel very less intimidating. If I'm going to use a term or I'm going to refer to a bill or a piece of legislation, how do I not only call it by that thing? Like, what is I guess I really hate using the term dumbed down, but like, what is the easiest way to convey to someone what is happening right now? And then I will often think about it in terms of my parents, like how would they respond to this? And what are the questions that they would ask about it? Because you want your content to reach more people, especially for something like social causes or things like that. I don't know if that was a clear enough answer.
Yeah, and I invite everyone to continue these conversations and ideas that you may have, so that anteaters can lift each other up and learn from each other. But I'm glad folks are asking. We actually have several more questions. Unfortunately, probably don't have time to get to all of them. But Tracy, if you do have any quick answers, I'm going to try to rapid fire. Andrea Canfield asked, "What tools do you use for analytics to determine what type of posts and news storytelling the audience connects with, and the demographics? Any tools, quick advice?"
Yeah, it's the platforms themselves have analytics built into it. You might not always have access to it on a personal account. So for Instagram, for instance, you get deeper insights and analytics if you are a creator account or a business account. And anyone can kind of flip their profile over from a personal one to a business one. You don't need to like be a brand. That doesn't get you verified or anything, but it gives you more access to figuring out when the people who follow you are online, when they're the most active, and you can view your insights. Same with Facebook. You can kind of see on a page, they make those insights available to you. Now, they're not always the easiest to understand because sometimes they hide it behind a lot of different tabs, but Facebook has a creator studio where you can look kind of as a snapshot of what videos are performing well. I tend to look at not only reach, but engagement. So if you divide engagement by reach, you get something called engagement rate. And that's how I make every determination. So 100 people might see my post, but if only 10 people choose to engage with it in some way, that means that it was not very engaging. Whereas if 10 people saw my post and 10 people engaged with it, that means 100% of the people who saw it chose to do something about it. And so for me, that means that that's a more impactful piece of content, right? Because like you could tweet something and 2 million people might see it, but if nobody chooses to do anything about it, it's like tree falls in the forest, right? That's how I make those determinations. So I do go straight to the native platforms themselves to pull my analytics. We do have platforms and systems in place to kind of centralize it. So if we need to quickly look for something, we can refer to it. But these platforms do make it a little challenging. Like on TikTok, it's not like a one-stop shop. You do have to kind of scroll a bit to find specific information, but really figure out the metric you're looking for that is going to be the most important to you. So for instance, growing followers on Twitter might not be the thing you care the most about. It might be video views. So then keeping track of those video views and looking at like the ones that perform well, what is unique about that post, that to me that's helped me make a lot of decisions based around different platforms, because every platform will have a different purpose, which is why I have to go straight to the platforms to pull those analytics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it's great to know those tools are there for everyone to use if you want to explore Tracy's career path yourself and generate your own impact. So we're at the end of the hour, unfortunately. I'm so sad because we have many more good questions for you, Tracy. So we'll, hopefully we can we can. If you have follow-up questions to this event, we'll ask you to email alumni@uci.edu, and we'll do our best to connect you with Tracy on those questions. But for now, Tracy, I have to say humongous thanks for taking the time out of your day, as you said, to talk about your work, but enlighten everyone in the alumni audience and sharing all your insight. Everyone join me with another virtual thank you for Tracy.